And we now cross to Paris to get international perspective on Medvedev's proposal from John Laughlin, the Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. Mr. Laughlin, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this from Paris now. Looks like the international reaction to the proposal is very lukewarm. Why is that?
Well, it is. Don't forget that President Medvedev launched this idea originally last year in June 2008. And the reaction then was lukewarm as well. In fact, European leaders basically simply ignored it. The reason why this is the case is very simple. The Russian proposal that has now been formulated in the form of a draft treaty is quite simply a proposal to effectively to replace NATO. Of course, that's not what Russia is saying, because it knows that such a plan would never be accepted if it was presented that simply. But the key phrase about collective security and about each member of this proposed new organisation regarding an attack on itself, or an attack on another member as an attack on itself, is of course the key provision of NATO. So if this new organisation ever came into existence, it would effectively render NATO useless. Now, that is something which the Americans will never accept. At least there are many, many decades behind the American support for NATO. In fact, it goes back, I would say, to before NATO was even created. It goes back to before the outbreak of the Second World War. The Americans have had plans and a desire to keep their military presence in Western Europe and now in the whole of Europe in a structure which they themselves control. And they will be very reluctant to allow Russia to dilute that structure in any way that reduces their hegemony. The same, unfortunately, goes for European leaders, who also have a very long history of scepticism towards collective security agreements with Russia. So while I think it's a good proposal and it's an interesting one, it may encourage people to think and to declare their positions openly, I'm afraid I'm unfortunately pessimistic that it will have any real outcome.
Yeah, from your point of view, what could this pact achieve? Probably something that NATO and other security organisations can't at the moment.
Well, it could certainly have considerable political benefits. I mean, you know, we've been talking about overcoming the Cold War now for 20 years, and yet we really haven't seen very much progress towards it in terms of military arrangements. On the contrary, the Cold War structures, at least where NATO is concerned, have been strengthened and enlarged. So it would certainly have political benefits. But I suppose I'm basically sceptical about the overall idea. The concepts contained in the draft treaty, while desirable and while they exist in many other similar international organisations, in fact beg the question that they are supposed to answer. They talk about preventing any state from doing anything that will affect or be deemed to affect the security of any other state. Well, that's a great sentiment, but unfortunately international relations is based precisely on resolving these kinds of issues, and generally they are resolved on an ad hoc basis. It's quite difficult to resolve them in international forums. When states decide that their security is threatened, if the international forum that they belong to doesn't do what they want it to do and what they feel it needs to do, then they act anyway. And this is a simple fact of international relations, which no amount of international organisation or charter signing can ever overcome. So I think its main benefit, as I say, would be political. I would love to see it succeed. I think it should succeed. It makes sense for there to be such a structure. But as I say, I think there'll be a lot of scepticism, and people will do as much as they can to prevent having, to avoid having any real discussion on the subject.
All right, thank you very much, sir. That was John Laughlin, the Director of Studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation.